Hello. Audrey, when is Rabbi Rachel coming back to the United States?
She is coming back the sometime during the week of Passover, so the end of April, mid-April. Yeah, she had I don't know. I should send them to Layla. She's been writing blog posts for in social solidarity that are really wonderful. The one that I received today was just incredible. She led Kabbalat Shabbat last Friday at the community that she's been part of, and she sang Psalm 98 using the melody of the Ukrainian national anthem.
Oh my.
Only Rachel could put that together
Right.
in a way to be able to do it. So, but her writing has just been exquisite about what she's been up to, and she's actually doing an interview on Sunday morning with the rabbi who is the leader of the congregation they've been going to. So she's been doing these kind of remote interviews for our community.
And
So the
which
idea of sabbatical, she really is sharing her experience there with us here.
which congregation is it?
I don't have it in front of me. I'll send you the social solidarity, and you can look at it. Okay.
Okay, great. Great.
But she'll be with us. She'll be in our community for some time after she comes back from sabbatical, even
Great.
though her news is that she's leaving the community. But
Great.
it's a great opportunity to savor her for a few more months and enjoy, and then
You just say she's leaving the community?
Yes.
yeah, Shlomo, you didn't know that?
No, I didn't.
I'll
Wow.
send you the information. That's right. You wouldn't have known it. She's leaving for a wonderful new position at Jessa, in a senior rabbi position, managing and putting together a whole new Jewish engagement program there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'll send you the information, okay?
Thank you.
Okay, Layla, I think you can start.
Okay, good. So let's start with bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So today is Ta'anit Esther, which is the fast of Esther, and tonight we read the Megillah for Purim. Ta'anit Esther is a dawn to nightfall fast held on the day before Purim begins, and it commemorates the fasting of our ancestors in response to the dramatic chain of events that occurs during the exile in the Persian Empire. These events are recorded in the book of Esther and the salvation that came about at the time that we celebrate Purim. Now, fasting is associated with some pivotal moments in the Purim narrative. One such moment is when Esther approached King Ahasuerus without permission in an effort to intercede on behalf of the Jewish people. And before she went to the king, she fasted for 3 days and asked that all the Jews of the kingdom fast as well. Another dramatic turnaround occurred on this day, the 13th of Adar, the date that Haman has set aside for killing the Jews. Instead, the Jewish people were victorious over their enemies, and the triumph was accomplished while the Jews were fasting as they prayed to God to be successful. At this very moment, there is a new Ta'anit going on and a demonstration going on in front of the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. It's called a Ta'anit Tzibur, a public fasting, the day coinciding with Ta'anit Esther, and many people from the Jewish community are there demonstrating against the Russians because of what the tragedy and the terror that's happening in Ukraine at this very moment. So I wanted to ask us to take a moment and to be in solidarity with those who are there and to pray for a moment for the welfare of the people of Ukraine. I know that many of us have our family roots in Ukraine. My mother was born in Odessa, and every time I hear of what's happening there and throughout Ukraine, my heart sinks a little more. And I watched President Zelensky's speech this morning, and it moved me greatly. So let's just take a moment of quiet contemplation and prayer. Amen. So we are today exploring Parashat Tzav, which means command. And this is from Vayikra chapter 6, beginning with the first verse and ending in chapter 8, verse 36. The Haftarah is from the book of Jeremiah. And as I spoke a little bit last week about the sacrifices, we will talk a little bit more about them a little later. But I wanted to consider, as for a change, I wanted to consider the Haftarah that goes along with this section. In the Haftarah, the prophetic portion for this Parsha, we have a seeming contradiction from the Torah portion. There are two things that go on in this Torah portion. The first is the korbanot, the sacrifices, and then the second part of it is the dramatic and tragic and perhaps not so tragic story of Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's sons, who set a fire that's called an Esh Zarah, a strange or an alien fire, and what happens to them. And we will get to that as well. But let's look at the Haftarah for a second, which is in Jeremiah chapter 7, starting in verse 21 to 28, and then in chapter 9, verses 22 and 23. So in this section, there is an interesting contradiction between what Jeremiah says and what is in the Torah portion. Reading Parashat Tzav and the Haftarah assigned to it can be a jarring experience, since the two appear to contradict one another dramatically and directly. After laying out an array of laws related to sacrifice, the Torah portion adds, such are the rituals of the burnt offering, the olah, the meal offering, mincha, the purification offering, the chatat, the guilt offering, the asham, the offering of ordination, miluim, and the sacrifice of well-being, the zevach hashlamim, which Adonai commanded, tzivah, Moshe on Mount Sinai, when Adonai commanded that the Israelites present their offerings to Adonai in the wilderness of Sinai. Twice in one verse, verse 38, Vayikra emphasizes that God directly commanded the sacrificial system. The main thrust of this verse is the assertion that already in the wilderness of Sinai, the Israelites worshipped God with sacrifices. But then let's consider Jeremiah. In chapter 7, verse 22, he says, "When I freed your fathers from the land of Egypt, I did not speak with them or command them concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices." So, on the surface at least, Yirmiyahu appears to boldly contradict the Torah's words. Reading Leviticus and Jeremiah together, one cannot but ask, which one is it? Did God command Israel to offer sacrifices or not? In ostensibly repudiating sacrifices, Jeremiah tells the people what God did in fact enjoin. "But this is what I commanded them. Obey my voice, that I may be your God, and you may be my people. Walk only in the way that I command you, so that all may go well with you." In other words, Jeremiah does not seem to endorse sacrifices, but rather obedience and fidelity to God. Now, it may be that Yirmiyahu is speaking hyperbolically, insisting in the strongest possible terms that in order to have integrity or value, sacrifice must grow out of a broader commitment to covenantal obedience, to serving God with all we have and all we are. Perhaps he is saying that sacrifice without religious integrity is not just meaningless, it is actually abhorrent to God's eyes. But the point is not that religious integrity is an alternative to sacrifice. Rather, religious integrity is what renders sacrifice coherent and meaningful. Were Jeremiah really seeking to disown sacrifice altogether, it would be impossible to understand his clear vision of a glorious future, when worshippers from every corner of the land will flock to Jerusalem, quote, "bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices, meal offerings and frankincense, and bringing offerings of thanksgiving to the house of the Lord." Yirmiyahu does endorse sacrifice, but not empty sacrifice. Perhaps what Yirmiyahu means to say is not that sacrifices do not matter at all, or that they were not commanded by God, but rather that they were never understood to be central or the most important aspect of obedience that God demanded from Israel. So we have to be very careful here not to see the sacrifices as the central point. The central point is obedience. Rabbi Shai Held offers the suggestion that we attend closely to the structure of the book of Exodus. If one reads the account of Sinai, he argues, regulations about sacrifice do not occupy a central place. God begins with the 10 Commandments and then proceeds to lay out a range of laws concerning everyday life. This is Rabbi Held now. It is only after the covenant is ratified that stipulations regarding sacrifices are given. The message of Exodus is clear. Obedience to God was first defined as devotion to God alone. That's in the first 4 commandments. And then through ways in which relationship with God was to be expressed by humans, commandments 5 through 10. So Jeremiah, a faithful reader of Shmot, of Exodus, Jeremiah rightly claims that God had not commanded sacrifices as the essential feature of covenantal obedience. Indeed, the thrust of Jeremiah's fiery words is that where the basic requisite of obedience was lacking, God refused to regard what went on in the temple as a true sacrifice. Jeremiah is not opposed to the sacrificial system laid out in Parashat Tzav, nor is he opposed to ritual in general, but he is intensely worried that sacrifice and ritual can be used in hypocritical, counterproductive ways. It is easy to miss one of his subtlest, most telling criticisms of the Israelites and potentially of us. They trust in the temple and in the web of lies they have woven around it. This is from Jeremiah now, but not in God. Their religion, their religious acts serve to displace and replace God instead of serving and being responsive to God. This is an important truth we should always keep in mind and at heart. Few things can refine our souls and sanctify our lives like religion, but few things can be so easily exploited and corrupted. That is why for the religious person, introspection and soul searching are so fundamental. And it is why for the religious community, self-criticism is as urgent as it can be rare. So what do Rabbi Held's and Jeremiah's concerns have to do with us in our contemporary context? Do we have a problem of what Rabbi Held calls a problem of buying God off and the problem of religious hypocrisy? What are our sacrifices without faith? Now, let's look at the screen share on Korbanot and see if we can see underlying motivations in this. Now, the first paragraph we have already looked at, that the word korban is trying to come close, traditionally translated as sacrifice, and the Latin sacri facere, to do well, from the root kuf resh bet, karov, coming to mean close. So let's go up a little and see what Rabbi Shefa Gold does with it on the spiritual meaning of korbanot. So we get first to the olah offering that is mentioned in this parsha. Can someone read, please, from the olah offering? Go ahead, Shlomo.
The Olah offering. There is a particular spiritual ailment that manifests itself as an inflation of the self. The mind is consumed with me. Everything seems to depend on me. I am obsessed by my memories, my plans, my importance, my spiritual path, my sickness, how I might manipulate the world to my benefit. The medicine for this condition must sometimes be drastic, namely the complete nullification of self. The olah is the burnt offering that is completely consumed by fire. Through the olah, we experience the complete surrender of the self to God's will. In prayer, the olah is the total surrender of me into the divine fires. When the self is entirely given in prayer, we may experience a moment of terror as the self dissolves. In that moment of dissolution, God welcomes the gift of our return and breathes in the sweet savor of our fragrance, which is self-distilled into pure essence. God then breathes our unique essence back into us, that we might be recreated. In that moment of divine pleasure, we experience a great and sublime relief. Reach nichoach ladonai, a sweet savor unto God.
Okay, let's stop here. So in Hasidut and in earlier thinking in Judaism, there is this notion of bitul hayesh, the nullification of self, that we are offering a sacrifice not because we are self-centered, not because it's about us, but because it's about God, and it's about our faith in God. The object, the items that we are sacrificing are really of less importance other than our showing that we want to come closer to God, not for selfish purposes, but for a larger purpose of coming as close to God as possible. Now let's connect that back up to Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu is saying that if we sacrifice in order to have a self-centered purpose, then it's not obedience to God, it's obedience to self. And that's exactly what he is trying to rail against. He's saying it's not your sacrifice that really matters, it's your faith and your attempt to likarev, to get closer to God for yourself. And that's another reason that the Israelite system was one that gave every single person, kol ha'edah, the opportunity to offer korbanot as modest as a handful of grain and as large as a full animal of cattle. So that's one of them. Okay, let's go to the next one, shlamim. Who would like to read that one?
This is Nancy. I'll be happy to read it.
Good, thank you, Nancy.
Shlamim, there's a particular spiritual disease that afflicts us when we are corrupted or insulated by our wealth and good fortune. It manifests as complacency and stinginess, as a lack of passion or sense of wonder. The shlamim is an offering of thanksgiving. It expresses our sense of wholeness and is given in response to the grace we receive. Our giving allows that grace to flow through us. This offering always culminates in a sacred meal shared with the givers, priests, and God. In prayer, the shlamim flows from our acknowledgement of the amazing richness of life. Through this offering, generosity is kindled in the heart. Giving becomes the natural response to receiving. Fullness overflows into the world and goodness is multiplied as it is shared. We can let our prayer express this wondrous overflow. Kosi Rivaya, my cup satisfies overflowing.
Okay, so here what we are seeing, can we go back down again just a little? So that this is indeed both self-directed and outwardly directed. So that, again, in Yirmiyahu's idea, obedience and faith to God gives us, our gift to God gives us back a gift. And the gift is to feel the connection with God through gratitude. And therefore, that kindles generosity and outward giving, and the natural response is giving, which then flows to other human beings, and we feel a deep sense of gratitude, a deep sense of well-being, which translates into a sense of the presence of God in our lives and faith of God in our lives. Okay. Let's go to the next one. Chatat. Who would read that one, please? Ralph?
Hatat. This is a particular spiritual disease that's caused by carrying the burden of past mistakes. It causes us shame, which cuts us off from God's love. We become defensive and seek to blame others. The kashat is an offering that lifts us, that lifts from us the sorrow of our errors. When awareness reveals that we have acted unconsciously and thus we've unintentionally done damage to others, our remorse can be transformed into resolve. Kashat celebrates the moment of clarity, purifying us from the obscuring effects of guilt or shame, empowering us toward to turn towards God, towards reconciliation and wholeness. Shivenu Adonai Elachad Shuva. Let us turn to you, and we will be turned.
So, go on.
Okay. In prayer, Kashat is the heart song that sings us freedom from the shame of our errors and turns our mistakes into clear instructions for repair and holiness.
Okay.
There are generally.
No, let's
Okay.
stop there. So again, the prayer, if you notice what's happening here, is each one of our offerings becomes an offering back to ourselves. Rather than just being a sacrificere that we are doing for God, an offering that we are giving to God, we are given something very, very powerful back. That we are saying we have sinned, we are ashamed. Then our shame is lifted from us and we are given this gift back to us. Every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur we sing, Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva. I just lost my voice.
Kadesh, Kadesh, Yameinu Kekedem.
Thank you. Thank you. So what it's saying is, take us back to the place when we were free of shame, when we were free of guilt, when we were free of a sense of wrongdoing. So what's happening here is as we give this offering, we are being cleansed of that sense of shame and guilt. So it's a reciprocal two-way relationship here. Okay, let's go on. Who will read this one? Gertie, can you read that, please?
There are, generally speaking, two types of korbanot: zevachim, slaughtered, and menachot, grain offerings. Zevachim, an overview. There are four basic types of zevachim. Olah, ascent, seems to refer to the sacrifice distinctive feature that the offering is completely burned on the altar, except for the hide, which is given to the participating priest. Thus, it totally ascends to God. Only male animals or doves or pigeons, male or female, are acceptable. Shlamim, from shalem or shalom, presents many possible interpretations. It may express a sense of well-being, wholeheartedness with God, a gift of greeting to God, or perhaps completeness. Altar, donor, and priest are all sharing it. Male or female animals are acceptable, but not birds. Certain fat and internal organs are placed on the altar by the Kohanim. The remainder, almost the whole animal, is permitted to be eaten. In Vayikra, chapter 7, the Torah ordains that any pure person is permitted to partake of the shlamim, thus allowing the donor to share it with family and invitees. Eating the shlamim is permitted during the day and night of the offering and the day following, and was not restricted to the sanctuary precincts. The Todah, Thanksgiving offering, a shlamim subdivision, is an exception in that it is only allowed to be eaten the day of its offering and the night following. Kohanim receive the breasts and the right thigh. And individuals, olah and shlamim, are voluntary offerings. Although their names may connote certain purposes, an expiation was mentioned in connection with the Olah. The reasons why one may bring an Olah are not provided. Note that the sages do provide several explanations for the Olah, notably that it is a form of expiation for neglected positive commandments.
Okay, so what these explanations are trying to demonstrate to you are that there is something wonderful and positive and lightening, not enlightening, but lightening about the sacrifices. When people bring these sacrifices, they feel lightened, they feel unburdened, and there is something that comes back. Notice that anyone who these are unintentional sins. These are unintentional neglect, not for active sins. This is the stuff of life. When one neglects something, when one unintentionally does something, one wants to clean out one's slate. One wants to create a tabula rasa for the coming time, a clean, empty plate that one can start again. One can lighten one's load. One can have one's family participate in this. The priests can be fed. The people can be fed. This isn't a grim ritual. And that's very, very important. This is, in some ways, a real celebration. Okay, let's go down to Chatat. And Gertie, can you continue there, please? You're muted, Gertie.
Chatat, sin offering, refers only to unintentional sins. Generally, those that had been done intentionally are culpable of karet, being city off from the community.
That should
Carelessness.
be cut off. I'm sorry. That's a typo. It should say being cut off from the community.
Okay. Carelessness and inadvertence indicate laxness as concerned one's responsibilities. Such transgressions defile the sanctuary. The chatat, bringing purification and expiation to the sanctuary, is a mandatory part of the unintentional sinner's repentance process. With the exception of the asham, guilt offerings brought for withholding testimony, intentional sins cannot be expiated by means of a sacrifice. 4 classes of chatat, varying according to the offender's status and without reference to the particular transgressions, are itemized. Those of the Kohen Hagadol, the high priest, the whole community of Israel, explained by the sages as based on a high court directive. The Nasi, the high political representative of the community, including the king and individual. From the sanctuary perspective, the first 2 classes reflect a graver transgression, impacting the spiritual welfare of the nation, and require an elaborate ritual involving a young bull, a blood sprinkling ritual on the parochet veil in the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, and upon the incense altar, as well as upon the bronze altar, and burning the complete bowl on the ash heap outside of the camp. The latter 2 classes of chatat lack these stringencies. After all, the Nasi is not an official religious leader. He brings a male goat, while the private individual brings a female goat or Eve. Male Kohanim, priests, eat from these latter offerings within sanctuary presents. 3 particular transgressions of omission that require a chatat offering for expiation are also listed. one who withheld testimony despite having heard an adjuration to testify. B, various cases of being impure in a span of forgetfulness and entering the sanctuary or eating sacred items. And C, inadvertently violating an oath. Depending on financial ability, one either brings a female sheep or goat, 2 birds, or a measure of flour. In the latter case, oil and frankincense are not added, reflecting the somber nature of the offering. Asham, guilt offering of a ram, referring to 3 specific classes of violations. A, Asham Me'ilah, an unintentional misappropriation for personal use of sanctuary property. The violator makes full restitution and pays a penalty of 1/5 in addition to the sacrifice. B, Asham Talui, the contingent Asham, when one has a doubt if he committed an unintentional transgression, that had he been certain he did transgress unintentionally, would require a chatat, and C, Asham Gizolot, a trespass against God in that one lied under oath, defrauding his fellow man concerning a deposit, loan, stolen article, found article, etc. When the defrauder chooses to repent, he restores the lost capital to the owner, adds 1/5 as penalty, and brings an Asham sacrifice. Although the sin was intentional, when the violator came forth himself to repent by making restitution and paying a penalty, he is allowed the expiation sacrifice.
Okay, can we put down the share screen? So a few things in general about the sacrifices, and then we can open it up for some response here. The first is that this is a society in which the so-called judicial system is very embryonic. Remember that in Exodus, at Jethro's advice, Moshe establishes a system of judging. And usually the judges judge the minor issues. And the major issues are brought to Moshe for adjudication. But they don't have what we would call a policing force. They don't have jails. They don't have ways to enforce castigation, as it were. So what happens at this point is there is essentially an agreement that those who are guilty of intentional or unintentional sins fall into one of these categories of sacrifices and need to go to the priests and need to embody or enact their penitence, as it were. And that's when the whole priestly system comes into being. And the priestly system, too, is pretty embryonic. So it's an entirely voluntary system. You don't have the kind of enforcement mechanisms that you will have later after the conquest, into the period of the monarchy. It's just beginning. So when you think about it in those terms, this is profoundly voluntary. When you think about it in those terms, when you think of it as being a profoundly voluntary system, it must have satisfied some real need of the people. And that's why I was emphasizing to you that this was a system that in some ways was, I don't know if the word is celebratory, or it was satisfying in some really deep way for someone who had done something either unintentionally or negligently to be able to find a way to reconnect with God through the sacrifice. And the individual who was in that category would readily come to offer a sacrifice without being pushed very hard to do it. It would come from the heart more readily. That's one thing I wanted to make sure that you understood. The second is that the establishment of the priesthood was something that the people themselves looked upon with great favor. It's only once the prophets come along and begin to see the excesses that the priests begin to perpetrate that you have the critique of the priesthood. But in its early years, it was a very admired institution amongst the people. And where do the priests get their support other than through the sacrificial system? That's how they ate. That's how they were sustained, was through the sacrificial system. When Jeremiah and Isaiah and the other prophets come along, they are critiquing the priests only because, not because the institution of the priesthood per se is wrong, but because, or that the priests shouldn't be supported. They believe in that, but they don't want the priests to become like the idols. They don't want the priests to be the point. They want the sacrifice to be the point, and they want the same feeling of satisfaction and connection to God to remain. And that's when they begin to criticize the priesthood for becoming its own somewhat selfish institution. The different kinds of sacrifices are meant to address the different kind of varieties of contingencies that exist in life. You know, you did this neglectfully. You neglected to do these mitzvot. You forgot. Okay, there's a way to solve that. There's a way to address that. You unintentionally sinned. There's a way to address that. And it's the beginnings of a mixture of a ritual and a judicial system together. Now, before I open it up for some questions and other things, Michael had an interesting point in the chat. You said, is this not the similar to what happens in the Catholic Church today? In essence, it is, except rather than sacrifices, they have confessionals. And someone who feels that they have sinned voluntarily comes to the priest and confesses and is told how to ameliorate their sin. It is usually through a donation to the church and prayers of...
Exactly my point. The sacrifice, the donation to the church so the people that the church can eat.
That's right.
Theory. I mean, they don't make that. That's not it, but that's the same underlying premise.
That's exactly right. And it is supporting the church institution, which means that the priest can eat, etc. Absolutely. So what do you think about this? Yeah, Camilla, you had your hand raised.
I was just wondering whether when rabbinical Judaism came to be, whether they tried to have a replacement for these kind of judicial sort of things.
It's a very good question. First of all, remember that rabbinic Judaism, for the most part, except for its inception in the land of Israel in the first century, end of the second century BCE, first century BCE, and then first century CE, is an exilic phenomenon. In most places where they moved to, as Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan would say, they voted with their feet, in the sense that the people themselves had outgrown the sacrificial system. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that they wanted something different. And what replaced sacrifices was prayer. That the rabbis worked very, very hard to take the same spirit of faithfulness to God and faith in God and to place it into community and prayer. And so a lot of the penitential prayers that we have in our Machzor and in our Siddur got established in those years, in those early years. They don't really get established into formal machzorim and sidurim until a little bit later on. The first ones that we have in formal prayer books come in around the 8th and 9th centuries. But prayer is what replaces sacrifice.
Yeah.
Okay. Audrey, and then Ralph, and then Bob.
Yeah, thank you. I love this what Jeremiah had to say, and I'm just trying to figure out, was Jeremiah in some way anticipating in his comments the fall of the destruction of the temple and saying we don't really need the temple as much anymore for all the reasons. What we can take out of this is our prayer, is another way of doing this. So in some ways he's easing the loss of the temple by suggesting something else that can take its place.
Absolutely. Remember that Jeremiah is a prophet of the time of the exile.
Correct.
He's there. He witnesses the destruction. He himself goes out into exile, and he knows that the priesthood and the temple and all of that is going to cease to exist. And what he wants to, his message to the people is, as long as you take your ardent, sincere, passionate prayer with you and your faith in God, you will be fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's brilliant that he
and it's very
his
interesting.
words.
And it's very interesting that the people who do go out into exile to Babylonia don't take sacrifice with them.
Right.
And, Babylon was a very hospitable place for them. And it's not entirely clear that the Babylonians would not have allowed them to replicate sacrifice in Babylonia. We don't know for sure, but they didn't bring it with them.
Right.
And they were the ones, first of all, the great academies were established there, and study and learning and prayer were their emphasis, but they didn't take sacrifice. They didn't even attempt to take sacrifice with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he
Thank you.
was definitely trying to give them an alternative.
The next thing we have to do is have you teach us the book of Jeremiah. If
Well, I've
you've not
done
had
that.
a chance to learn, yeah, we have to bring you back because your teachings on the book of Jeremiah are truly remarkable. A little plug for you.
Okay, thank you. Ralph and then Bob.
Well, I don't want to be guilty of bearing false witness. I think Bob had his hand up first, so
Oh,
I don't want to have to.
okay,
It's
then
okay, go ahead.
we're gonna go with that. Bob and then Ralph and then Steve.
All right, thank you. I want to thank you for pointing out this phrase in Jeremiah. I don't think I knew it before, but immediately it made me think about the phrase that I always look at in Isaiah, is this the fast that I have chosen?
Right.
It's the same kind of idea that it's not appropriate to do the ritual without also following the ethical precepts, and that it's better to have an internal process of return rather than just physically doing it. There has to be a spiritual return and a spiritual version of the sacrifice.
Right. Right. I also want to say that I misspoke. I was saying that we were going to do Nadav and Avihu today. We're not. That's next week. So I was preparing for that for both you and for another group that I teach, and I thought I got them mixed up, but we're not doing Nadav and Avihu today. Ralph and then Steve.
I just trying to understand how this would go down in a society. Some of these admissions are kind of very marginal, subjective kind of sins, and yet the payment is very steep. To have to sacrifice one of your rams or one of your goats must be very, to have somebody come around and say, well, maybe I did. And if they don't, I could see all the other people going tisk, 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 and kind of saying, shouldn't you fess up? I just don't like the dynamic that puts up. And this thing about the priests, another comment is the priests benefiting from this, almost things like our communities putting up speed cameras to get people to not do the sin of speeding, but it enriches their coffers.
Well, the society is not a society that's vigilante in any way. In other words, people aren't telling on each other, but it's a society that's very, very theologically based. And what we were talking about guilt and shame. Guilt and shame are definitely there, in the sense of, I have not followed the mitzvot. God has commanded me and I have not followed them, and it's incumbent upon me to fix that. That's there. That's there. And it's part of a society that says, I need to fess up for my sins. And this is kind of a cyclical thing. People aren't vilified for bringing their offerings; they are celebrated for it. So it's kind of part of the society to bring the offerings, and I don't. And if they can't afford the cow or the goat, they bring something less. It's not, it's never meant to be economically onerous on them. Steve, and then Nancy.
Yes, let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Didn't know if I was unmuted. So let me preface this by saying, my paradigm is as an agnostic and somebody dedicated to predicate theology. So wherever I hear God or wherever I read God, I put in godliness or something like that to try to make it relevant to me personally. That said, what really resonated with me and everything we've been reading, and sometimes I would drift off hearing of all these very material sacrifices, is the word resolve.
Mm-hmm.
That what's important is that you do the self-reflection. You have the resolve to fix what you did wrong, if possible, or at least commit yourself to living a more godly life in the going forward and not repeat the sins of the past. And I can't help, because I'm so focused on it these days, to reflect on what's happening in Ukraine and the situation with Israel and these Russian billionaires who have given a lot to Israel or other causes, and Britain as well, to accept citizenship, gain refuge, and this whole conflict of, I could pay off, irrespective of how ill-gotten those gains were, that has created the wealth, including Jewish Russian wealth, so to speak. That's not, too much of the civilized world has turned a blind eye to where all this wealth has come from, and will allow so many, unfortunately, to buy their way with it. So
Yeah, I agree with you on that, and I think the biblical ethos was always an ethos of correctiveness of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs speaks about the mitzvah system as being a system that was ingrained in the Israelites of doing right and doing good. It was an ethical system that saw the mitzvot of doing what was, in your terminology, godly. And what we're witnessing now with many of the Jewish millionaires and billionaires is exactly an antithesis to that. Absolutely, absolutely. Nancy?
Well, I was struck by, I have one comment and one question. I was struck, Layla, one thing you said about the celebratory aspect of this. Because I remember when I first came to Adat Shalom early on, and I would hear people speaking from the Bima at times about really kind of confessional things, bringing up sort of personal things that they had struggled with and had finally gotten to a point of some kind of resolve in it. And at first, I was almost embarrassed for them. I was like, how could they get up and speak in front of this so many people and share some sort of deep secrets, family secrets or whatever? But then I realized sort of that process of opening up, of sharing, of admitting whatever the difficulty was, really gave people in the congregation a lot of empathy and really proud that somebody could get up and really speak their truth in a way. And so it just kind of reminds me of what you're saying of the sort of celebratory, like I could sort of see, yes, I'm willing to sort of get up and say, I made this mistake and this is how I'm going to resolve it. So it doesn't have to be, a negative. It can really be a strength to the person and then the community around them, to sort of see that.
And I think that's what they were doing. I think they were wanting to adhere to an ethical way of living, and when they were not being ethical or they were being neglectful, they wanted to make that right. And one of the ways of making that right was to bring that sacrifice.
So my question is, how you talked about these were all things that were basically unintentional sins. I think you mentioned like there were some intentional sins, but what was the judicial system like in terms of if you really committed a crime, if you killed somebody, or if you did something really, who made that decision that that's okay, you have to leave the community completely versus you can sacrifice?
That would be Moses and the elders. The Moses and the elders would make that decision, and it would really be. They don't really go into what happens to the individual other than being cut off, correct, other than being cut off from the community. There were many situations that were, they said they were subject to capital punishment, but as far as we know, that was never actually enacted. There's no place in the Torah that tells us that this was ever enacted. It was spoken about, but it was never enacted. Also, there were cases of unintentional murder, unintentional killing, and I don't want to use the word murder, in which there were then cities of refuge, places where the person who did the killing could go to live and be safe from revenge from the family of the victim, and could live in safety for whatever amount of time, and it was often permanently. Lawrence Kushner has a very good book called Cities of Refuge, where he talks about this. And most of the time, thank you, Franna, my peanut gallery, would talk about paying restitution for the crime. So somebody's waving at Amy. I think this will be the last comment because we're running out of time.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the idea of bringing people in for sacrifices is really important psychologically, because if you are an egotist, and you are a greedy person who doesn't connect with people through charity, if you're a person who has shame, those are all very isolating. And when you bring them to a public forum, it sort of reconnects you and helps you get over those problems that can put one in a psychological exile.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Community, it lifts the burden and brings the person back into community. That's absolutely true. Thank you for that comment. I think it's a very perceptive comment. Well, our time has run out. I want to wish all of you a Chag Purim Sameach. And one last comment about Purim, that whatever the masks you're wearing that you want to get rid of them and put on a fun mask tonight. So have a wonderful Purim, and I will see you all next week. Okay.
There's a
Thank
lot
you.
of activities on Sunday, both on Zoom and in person. So I just sent out a reminder to the Jewish Studies listserv. So feel free to take advantage of that. Also, Jerome Kapolsky is coming back in the end of March to teach Book of Samuel 1 and 2. And again, really outstanding teacher. I hope you can join us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Talk
Thank
some
you.
more.